what's going on there, guys? Today we're going to be turning this stylistic fashion photo by Dom Hill into this full 3D animation, all from using Photomotion Horizon. This time we're also going to be adding several elements to this picture in order to show you guys that you're really not limited to just the photo. So first, as usual, let's get to separating her out from this picture. So of course we're going to create a duplicate from our background just over here so that we can have something to work from. Right, so as we're going to be cropping this picture within Photomotion, we also want to add a little bit more to the sides so we have some more room to play around with a little. This can help just in terms of framing to make sure everything's just right. In order to do this, just change the canvas size by just going over to canvas size up here and then change this measurement to pixels over here. And what we're going to do is just change the width to 2336 or however much you want to add. In our case, we're just going to do a small amount as we know that we'll be cropping this later. Right, so obviously these edges aren't exactly what we're looking for in regards to our photo, so let's just get to selecting them by holding Control and then clicking on our photo layer just over here, then select either the quick selection tool or the polygonal lasso tool and then right click on the selection on the image and click select inverse. What that will basically do is just make sure that we're selecting these side panels here and not the overall image. What we'll then want to do is just right click again, then go to fill, and then we'll use content aware fill here just to save us a little bit of time. And there we go, not too bad of a job here with content aware. To be honest, it's quite good and doesn't really need any adjusting, so let's just move on from here. So with that done, let's just focus on separating this person here from the image by just using the quick selection tool just over here. Just try and be as precise as possible, although we'll be getting to finiting this mask in a bit. And with that done, we're just going to go up here to select a mask just to perfect our edges. Right, so the next part involves us finiting our edges here in order to create the most clean mask as possible. We're just trying to make sure that our selection is the best it can be, with our model finally masked out of this picture with none of the sky tagging along and us not losing any detail. In Horizon, just like Parallax, the better the mask is, the better the animation. So again, as usual, take your time and be patient in order to get the best results. Okay, so with that done, go to output over here and then change this drop down to new layer with mask. She's now contained into our own separate layer and we can focus on creating a clean plate. Okay, so you're probably wondering why we have these bars back here again, and that's because it's part of the very background layer which is locked. Remember, we're working from the duplicate, not from the actual original image. So if you see these, don't worry, no need to repeat what we did earlier, just enable this layer 1 as that's the layer we have been working on, not the very background. So with all of that said, let's just get our selection back by holding Alt and then clicking on this mask here. Then we're going to hide this layer whilst also revealing our layer 1 here and making sure it's also selected. We're then going to expand our selection by just going over to select, then modify and finally expand. Our expansion will be set to roughly around about 15 pixels, so not too much here. And once we're done, we're just going to right click on that selection, then go to fill, and then we're going to be greeted with this content aware fill. Just make sure again that your settings are the same as ours. Okay, so content aware isn't exactly infallible, but this is an okay result as far as it goes. Still needs some tweaking, however, so let's just go over to the patch tool and just fix some of these edges where we can spot distortions within our picture. Some of these distortions may include the edges of the mask, areas that shouldn't be in focus, and vice versa. Just be careful because as within this instance, we have the shadow of the basketball hoop just over here, so we're going to need to use a more delicate tool as not to create a problem with the shadow. Okay, so clone stamp should do the trick, but just be aware of these things when you're creating your clean plates. Okay, so with our clean plate done, let's just get to quickly renaming it to avoid any confusion within After Effects. We're going to be looking into adding some additional elements, so with this image we wanted to add a few birds and bushes here and make it all seem part of the original photo. So let's just import our seagulls here and then we're just going to position them just over here in the corner behind our subject. Color-wise, they're not exactly fitting into our overall scene. So let's just adjust that by going over to image, then adjustments, and lastly hue/saturation. We're then just going to make them a little bit more brighter so they're not as dark and popping out within our scene. We're also going to add a small blur here just to make them fit a little bit better within our background to a similar depth that's comparable to our basketball hoop here. Cool, so they're still popping out of our scene a little bit too much, so let's just adjust hue/saturation again, just changing their overall hue to a more bluish tinge just to match the sky so they blend in quite nicely within our background with this blue effect. Cool, so it looks quite natural there. So with our seagulls settled in, let's get to moving in our bushes into the foreground. So on our desktop we have this bush PNG just over here. Let's bring that into Photoshop. A little small at the moment, so let's just look at scaling them up. For this tutorial, don't worry about pixel pixelation. We will be adding a blur effect later on covering this up, but if you want them in focus, it's probably best to use a higher resolution PNG if you're using a different example. So we want this just kind of poking into our frame, and much like the birds, we'll want to change the hue saturation again, changing the color so it's a tad more blue and bring the levels down as it's a little bit bright and distracting. So let's also add a little bit of blur here by again going to filter, then blur, and then Gaussian blur. What we want to do is just give it this out of focus look, like it's bang smack in the forefront of our image. Let's move on to the next bush. No need to repeat any of the steps that we've already done here. Let's just look at duplicating it and then just adding some rotation here, bringing it to the far corner in the opposite end. Of course, while we're moving it, we won't see any of the effects, but rest assured they are still there while we move this object to our desired placement. Okay, so with all of that sorted, let's rename these two layers quickly. Okay, so cool. Now onto the After Effects part of the tutorial. Let's just jump into the latest version of Horizon, and as most of you are already aware, Photomotion is a viewport-based application, so no need to install any plugins and whatnot. It's all done in-house within this project, and most of the time, all you'll necessarily need is just the buttons on the dashboard and effect controls to create whatever you want. So let's begin. Okay, so we can just start by just clicking on the Start Horizon button over here. What that will do is just bring you into the main dashboard, and when you get here, you'll probably notice that everything is blanked out, so you can't really do anything other than just click on this Add Photo button over here. So let's do that now. We'll also be adding in our Photoshop project here from the desktop, and just make sure that when we reach this pop-up to ensure that your import kind is set to composition. Otherwise, you'll be merging all of your layers back into one, which isn't exactly what we really want. Okay, so from here, let's get to finding our clean plate in the project window and then dragging it into this project. We'll then need to make sure that we parent it to this layer on top whilst holding shift. That will just make sure that any attributes we change to this layer applies universally within your project. This will become a little bit clearer when we need to import the rest of our layers. Okay, so just make sure to scale and position this layer using the top parent layer, and once you're done, let's just hop over to the main dashboard. You'll see that it's all lit up now and that our cage options have become available. So just select the center module and place it where roughly your horizon is. In this case, it's just over here. The next step is a little bit complicated, but bear with us and we'll talk you through it. What we'll need to do is start adapting our floor plates to the angle of the floor within the picture. So within this example, we'll need to add some rotation to it, and we can do so by just clicking in the floor plates and then going to effect controls just over here, and then finally adding some overall rotation to the floor plate so the lines meet this corner here just on the pavement. We'll then add another plate so that we can match the flat face of the corner here. So just click this activate floor 2 just over here within effect controls, and just add some rotation here so it matches the flat face, and then just shorten it from the main controller. Okay, so we're just going to add our last floor plate just over here, which will then cover the floor at the very bottom. So just click on activate floor 3, click on the floor plate, and then finally add some rotation in order for it to match the floor in the background. So essentially what you should be left with is this rough 3D representation of the 3D scene here, which will prove as a baseline for any of the elements that need to be stuck in place for our animation to work. Let's just get to importing our subject now by going to layer 1, then clicking on import, and finally dragging these bushes over here and then placing it on top of this layer here, and then we're going to select both of these bushes and then we're going to parent them to the layer above. As mentioned before, we've already scaled our image from the background layer, so as long as you properly parented it within that composition, we won't need to play about with any of the scaling or positioning in regards to having the right proportion for our animation. Okay, so with that done, let's go back to the main dashboard, and the next thing we'll be doing is just doing exactly the same with our other layers. So just go into this layer 2 over here and import our main subject. As mentioned before, just drag and drop the layer into the composition, then parent her whilst holding shift to this layer above in order to have her scaled proportionately with the rest of our animation. Okay, so with that done, let's go back to the main dashboard and do exactly the same with our last layer. So we'll be putting these seagulls within this layer 4, and then once we've dragged and dropped it from the project panel into our composition, just parent them to the layer above whilst holding shift. Before we move on, however, we just need to check one thing, and that's whether our subject is attached to our cage within the animation. So what we're going to do is again just adjust the rotation of this last floor plate just over here and make sure it's as close to her feet as possible without actually going through them like, well, case in point. If we don't make sure of this, our subjects might not be properly fixed into that 3D position, and we'll encounter a problem like this. Right, so with our main cage complete, let's get to the creative part of animating our image. First, go down to the animate button just down here, and then click on the checkbox, now in effect controls, called Show Controls Animation. What that will do is just swap over our cage setup for this animation one. So first things first, let's just change our aspect ratio by just clicking on this resolution button over here, and then swapping this default, which we really don't want as it will leave us with a ton of empty space, and we're going to replace that with portrait. Okay, so once that's done, you'll now see that our animation is cropped within this portrait resolution, which is pretty handy for animations that are designed to go on social media, like say for example Facebook or Instagram. Okay, so while we're at it, let's just change our main export resolution to 1080p to 4K. In case you're wondering, no need to worry about sluggish playback, as we have the speed workflow enabled, which means that while you'll be exporting in 4K, our preview will still stay the same. Okay, so with all of that set up, let's get to setting our animation length by changing our frame count over here to timecode, and then moving our time head to roughly the 5 seconds point. Do make sure that you take a note of this, as we will need this information later. With that done, let's just mark out in order to make our work area a little bit more cleaner. So let's zoom in our animation by clicking on the magnifying glass on the controller, and then we'll be dragging this zoom slider along. We'll also add some vertical motion and change this multiplier so it keeps in frame with her face. We'll then reposition in order to frame correctly, and then we'll lastly add some tilt here just to make it a tad more dynamic. Once we're done, you'll notice that we have a slight problem concerning our background. Well, we're spotting some negative space over here, just indicated by the white fill over on our main animation. Okay, so that's not good, and we really don't want that within our main animation, so we really want to fix that quickly. So let's get to doing that now by just going over to the other button on the main dashboard and then dragging this white edge fix along. That'll basically just mirror out our background. Much better. Most of this problem is now fixed. However, if you look to our left top hand corner just over where the sun is, it might be difficult to see, but we still have this problem remaining just over on our side here. So to get rid of this problem over here, let's just go back to that add photo layer, the place that we imported our clean plate, and then we're going to select the base Photoshop layer, not the layer we parented it to, and then what we're going to do is just apply a repeat tile effect within the effects panel. So once that's done, just drag these expand right and left values and then change the tiling to unfold in order to get rid of these edges here. If we go back to the main animation now, you'll see that our problem is now completely gone, which is excellent. So with that over and done with, let's apply a depth of field effect here by going over to the animation button and then checking this depth of field checkbox and slightly increasing this blur strength over here. So we really don't want the lock focus to be on our bushes in the forefront, so let's change that now by checking this lock focus on layer 2 where our subject is. What that will basically do is just lock the focus on our second layer within the animation, which is pretty handy. Next, let's just get to adding some more perceived depth into this animation by adding some particles. We can do that by just clicking on the particles button just over here and then checking this activate particles checkbox over here. Now by default, we'll see this particle type number 1, these petals here. So let's change those as it's hardly suitable for this kind of animation. Something like this looks nice, number 16, although it's slightly distracting with our overall image. So let's dial down the alpha channel in the curves by just clicking on this drop down next to channels and then crushing these highlights here. So if we go back to the very beginning of our animation and fade out the dashboard controls by going over to that other button again and then clicking on the checkbox fade buttons, we can see that our bushes are kind of cut off at the bottom here. So in order to fix this problem, what we'll then do is just click on this layer 1 here and then go to effect controls and move the Z axis position so they're a little bit closer to the camera within the animation. So that removes the issue within layer 1, but then we'll go into layer 1 and scale down these bushes so they take the same amount of room as before. So we'll go into layer 1 of course and then select both of these base Photoshop layers. Note, do not select the top layer that we parented them beforehand. We want to scale these independently from our overall animation, and then hit S on your keyboard to bring up these scaling attributes, and then just bring down these attributes, but just make sure not to make them too small, otherwise we will run into the same problem again. So once we get back into the main dashboard, let's just have a look and we can consider that issue fixed. Very good. Let's just bring back our buttons by clicking on the other button on the main dashboard again and then unchecking this fade buttons checkbox. Looking great so far. Let's get to previewing our animation and seeing what's missing from our overall project. Very good, really coming along, but we're missing some of the final touches in terms of bringing this animation to life. So let's just puppet our subject here. Okay, so how we're going to do this is just by accessing this layer 2 over here and then just double clicking on this puppet button. Just make sure that the base layer is selected, our time head is at the very beginning of the animation, and then we're going to use this puppet tool just up here in order to create that subtle animation. So we just want to apply some points here scale to where our joints are, we only need a select few. So with all of that done, let's just bring our playhead to the 5 seconds point. Now why 5 seconds? Well, if you remember, we set our main animation to 5 seconds, so this animation has to be 5 seconds as well in order to match our main one. If you've chosen a different animation length like 7 seconds or 3 seconds, that's fine, but you have to make sure that these two animations match in terms of time. Okay, so with that disclaimer over with, just bring your needle to the 5 seconds point, mark out, and then begin moving your point very subtly within your animation. Remember, try not to go overboard, small movements will be picked up and it will look more natural. Once you're done with the layer selected, hit U on your keyboard to bring up all of these keyframes for that layer, and what we're going to do is just select all of them and then hit F9 in order to convert them to easing. That way your animation slows down at the beginning and the end, adding this really nice smoothness to it. Looking really nice so far, that looks really cool. Okay, so with that done, let's move back to our main dashboard. Really happy with this, and it's probably ready for exporting now. So just double click on this export button just down here in order to bring us into the screen. What we'll see here is the Photomotion Perfect Cut system and these two buttons in case we want to add any further effects. Well, let's see about adding some more scale to the overall animation by going over to the settings button and then adding a very small pinch. So with that done, let's set out our render time. If you look at the Photomotion Perfect Cut system, we can see that if we mark out 150 frames, we'll end up with no loops within our animation. If we wanted it to loop out, we'd choose 300, and for more, we could choose 600, and so on. For now though, we're perfectly content with just the 150 frames, but it's not exactly clear how we're seeing those frames at the moment because we're measuring our composition in time. So go back to the time units over here and change it to frame count. We'll then change this to 150, which will bring our playhead to the 150 mark. If you check out the Photomotion Perfect Cut system, you can now see that it's giving us a green light here, and then we'll mark out in order to make sure that we're only rendering one loop, not the whole timeline. Right, so with everything in the bag now, let's get to rendering. Just go up here onto composition and then add to render queue, which will then open up this tab at the very bottom of After Effects. Next step is just to click on this lossless down here, as we don't want to render out an AVI, as we'll end up with an animation 600 megabytes in size, and then change it to QuickTime, which is far easier and less hassle. A quick note, we really don't need to change the resolution at all because, as said before, since we already changed that resolution to 4K, it will automatically apply here. Just press the render button just over here. And there you have it, very stylish animation. If you have any questions regarding this tutorial, please do not fear to hit up the live chat, and we hope you've learned something new today. Until next time.